Hello, my name is Ben, and I'm 34 years old. Up until recently, I thought I had a solid handle on life. I've been married to my wife, Emily, for 8 years. We have a cozy house in the suburbs, 2 dogs, Cooper and Max, and what I assumed was a comfortable, loving relationship. I'm writing this because something feels off. Emily and I have always had our ups and downs like any couple, but lately things have been different. For starters, her demeanor has shifted. She's always been an extroverted, fiery personality, someone who lights up every room she walks into. But over the past few months, she's become distant, almost indifferent. It started small, brushing off my attempts at affection, dismissing plans for date nights, and showing little interest in spending time together. I try to chalk it up to stress. Emily's job in marketing can be demanding, and her boss, Mr. Jason Miller, is notoriously intense. She's mentioned late-night brainstorming sessions and client meetings that stretch into weekends. I believed her. Why wouldn't I? But as the weeks turned into months, her behavior became harder to ignore. She started guarding her phone like it was a national secret, even taking it into the bathroom when she showered. And then there were the sudden, unexplained mood swings. One moment, she'd be cheerful and chatty, and the next, she'd snap at me for the smallest thing. I'd find myself apologizing for things I didn't even think were wrong. I told myself I was overthinking things. It's easy to spiral when life feels stagnant, and I've been under pressure at work too. I manage a team at a tech startup, which means I've got my fair share of late nights and last-minute demands. Maybe we were just growing apart temporarily. That happens, right? But then came last Saturday. Emily claimed she was going to a team-building dinner with Jason and a few coworkers. It sounded legit. She's been talking about how Jason's trying to build morale in the office. But when I casually asked her where they were going, she froze for a split second. Not long enough for most people to notice, but I've known Emily for years. I noticed. It's some Italian place downtown. I'll have to check the name, she mumbled, avoiding my eyes. That nagging feeling in my gut intensified, but I forced myself to let it go. I didn't want to be that guy, the paranoid husband who questions his wife's every move. So I let her leave, giving her the benefit of the doubt. But later that night, as I sat on the couch watching reruns, something gnawed at me. She hadn't called or texted to check in. When I texted her, asking how dinner was going, I got a short, "Good. Busy night. Talk later." And that was it. No photos of the fancy Italian food she always loves showing off. No funny anecdotes about her coworkers. Nothing. Now I'm here, typing this out, because I feel like I'm going crazy. Am I reading too much into this? Or is my gut trying to tell me something? After that Saturday, things only got weirder. Emily didn't mention the team-building dinner again. Normally, she'd at least have a funny story to share about Jason's over-the-top pep talks or a coworker's awkward jokes. This time, radio silence. When I asked about it the next morning, she waved it off like it wasn't worth discussing. It was fine. You know how work stuff is boring. She barely glanced up from her coffee, eyes fixed on her phone like it held the secrets of the universe. I told myself to drop it. Maybe it really was a boring work dinner, and I was overthinking. But that little voice in the back of my head wouldn't shut up. If it was so boring, why did she seem so nervous about it? A few days later, I decided to shake the funk we were in by planning a date night. I reserved a table at our favorite steakhouse and even picked up a new shirt, hoping to rekindle some of the spark we'd lost lately. When I told Emily about it, she hesitated before saying, "Oh, that sounds nice, but I think I might have to work late Friday. Jason's been piling on these last-minute projects." Jason. Always Jason. "Can't you reschedule?" I asked, trying to sound casual even though disappointment was creeping in. "We haven't had a proper night out in forever." "I'll try," she said with a quick, forced smile. "I'll let you know." Friday came, and unsurprisingly, she texted me around 5 p.m. saying, "Sorry, babe. Can't make it tonight. Still at the office." I told her it was fine, but deep down, I was anything but. Instead of sulking at the steakhouse alone, I ordered takeout and spent the evening wondering when we'd become 2 people living separate lives. The distance between us grew in the weeks that followed. Emily was always busy. Busy with work. Busy with friends I hadn't heard of before. Busy with errands that seemed to pop up out of nowhere. Even when she was home, It felt like she wasn't really there. We'd sit in the same room, her scrolling endlessly on her phone while I tried to fill the silence with meaningless chatter. She barely responded, and when she did, it was like talking to a stranger. Then there was her phone, always glued to her hand. She used to leave it lying around, sometimes forgetting where she'd put it. Now, it never left her sight. She'd take calls in another room and angle the screen away if I happened to glance in her direction. Once, I jokingly said, "What's with all the cloak and dagger stuff? Planning a surprise party for me?" She laughed, but it was strained. "Don't be silly. Work stuff. Boring, remember?" It was like she was daring me to ask more questions, knowing I wouldn't want to be the suspicious husband. But honestly, it was getting harder to fight the urge. The turning point came one evening when I got home early from work. Emily had said she'd be running errands, but when I walked in, I heard her on the phone in the kitchen. Her voice was low, almost a whisper. I couldn't make out what she was saying, but something about her tone made my stomach churn. When she saw me, she jumped like I caught her sneaking out. "Oh, hey, you're home early," she said, quickly ending the call and setting her phone face down on the counter. "Who was that?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. "Just Lisa," she replied, naming one of her coworkers. "She's having some drama with her boyfriend. You know how it is." Except I didn't know how it was. Lisa's name hadn't come up in months, and Emily didn't usually get so animated about other people's relationship drama. But I let it go, even though the sinking feeling in my chest told me something was wrong. That night, as I lay awake staring at the ceiling, I started to wonder if Emily was keeping more than secrets from me. The night after her mysterious phone call, I decided to do something I never thought I'd stoop to: snooping. Look, I know it's not the most honorable move, but at this point, my head was spinning. Emily's secrecy and strange behavior were driving me up the wall. If I was overthinking, I needed confirmation so I could move on. And if I wasn't, well, I needed to know that too. So, the next morning, when she got up to shower, I grabbed her phone off the nightstand. My heart was pounding as I swiped up to unlock it, but of course it was password protected. She'd changed her passcode a few weeks back, claiming it was for security reasons. I didn't push at the time, but now I wished I had. I put her phone back before she could catch me and decided to take another approach. Later that day, while she was out running errands, I sat down at our home computer. Emily and I share the desktop for paying bills, printing stuff, and the occasional Netflix binge. I figured there might be something, an email, a calendar event, anything that could give me some clarity. At first, everything looked normal. Grocery lists, work emails, a bunch of Pinterest boards for DIY crafts she never actually does. But then, buried in the downloads folder, I found something odd: a confirmation email for a hotel booking. The subject line read, "Reservation confirmed, the Westview Hotel." I opened it, my hands trembling. The email wasn't for a romantic getaway for two, or even a work trip. It was for a single room, booked 2 weeks earlier. The reservation was for last Saturday, the same night Emily said she'd been at that team-building dinner. My chest tightened as I stared at the screen. Why would Emily need a hotel room in our own city? And why hadn't she mentioned it? I took a screenshot of the email and sent it to myself. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, but the pieces weren't adding up. That night, I tried to act normal, even though my mind was racing. Emily seemed her usual, aloof self, scrolling on her phone and occasionally glancing at the TV. I wanted to confront her right then and there, but something held me back. I needed more. The next day, I called the hotel, pretending to be Emily's assistant. "Hi, this is Lisa from Miller Marketing," I said, cringing at my own lie. "Could you confirm the check-in details for Emily Thompson's recent stay? We're sorting out reimbursement." The receptionist didn't even hesitate. "Certainly, Ms. Thompson checked in at 7:30 p.m. on Saturday evening and checked out the following morning at 10 a.m. Did she happen to mention if anyone else was joining her?" I asked, my voice shaking. "No, she was listed as the sole guest," the receptionist replied politely. "Would you like me to send over the invoice?" I declined and hung up, my mind spinning. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to come together, but they painted a picture I didn't want to see. If Emily had checked in alone, it didn't necessarily mean she'd been alone the entire time. And if she wasn't, who was she with? That night, I couldn't hold it in any longer. As we sat across from each other at the dinner table, The question slipped out before I could stop myself. So, how was the team-building dinner last Saturday? Emily looked up, startled. Huh? Oh, it was fine. Why? I shrugged, trying to sound casual. I just realized you never told me much about it. Where did you guys end up going again? Her eyes darted to the side, a classic tell I'd seen 100 times when she was caught off guard. Some Italian place downtown. I forget the name. The same vague answer as before. I leaned back in my chair, studying her. You're sure? Because I could have sworn I saw something about you being at the Westview Hotel. Her fork froze halfway to her mouth, and her face paled. For a moment, she just stared at me, her lips slightly parted like she was searching for an excuse. Then, with a laugh that sounded anything but natural, she said, What? No, that must be a mix-up. I don't even know where that is. I didn't press further. I wanted to see how far she'd go to keep up the charade. But as I watched her fidget through the rest of dinner, I realized two things. Emily was hiding something, and I was getting closer to finding out what. After Emily's awkward denial about the hotel, I decided it was time to dig deeper. Her reaction wasn't just defensive, it was panicked. The way she stammered and laughed nervously made it clear she was caught off guard. But the real question was, what exactly was she hiding? The next morning, while Emily was in the shower, I did something I never thought I'd do. I installed a tracking app on her phone. Look, I know it sounds invasive, but I wasn't trying to be some overbearing husband. At this point, I just needed answers. If she wasn't going to tell me the truth, I had to find it myself. The first few days were uneventful. She went to work, ran errands, and stopped by her favorite coffee shop, just like always. Part of me started to feel guilty, thinking maybe I was blowing this whole thing out of proportion. But then, Thursday evening happened. Emily left the house around 6 p.m., saying she had another late meeting with her boss, Jason. I didn't question her. Instead, I pulled up the tracker and watched as her location updated. Sure enough, she drove to her office, but she didn't stay there long. After about 20 minutes, her dust started moving again. This time, it stopped at a bar across town, a dimly lit place we'd been to once or twice for happy hour. I told myself it was innocent. Maybe she was grabbing drinks with coworkers after a long day. But when I zoomed in, I noticed something odd. The bar's parking lot wasn't where her dot had stopped. It was the parking lot behind the bar, near a small boutique hotel. My heart sank. I waited, staring at the screen, hoping she'd leave after a few minutes. But she didn't. Her dot stayed there for over an hour. I couldn't sit at home any longer, so I grabbed my keys and drove to the hotel. I told myself I wasn't going to do anything crazy, just confirm whether she was there or not. When I arrived, I parked across the street and waited. My palms were sweaty, and my mind was racing with worst-case scenarios. Finally, I saw her. She walked out of the hotel's side entrance, her phone in hand, looking around like she didn't want to be seen. She didn't look drunk, but there was a flush in her cheeks, and her hair was a little disheveled. My stomach churned. I stayed in my car, frozen. I wanted to storm up to her and demand answers, but I didn't. Instead, I followed her as she got into her car and drove home. I needed to know what she'd say about where she'd been. When I got home, Emily was already in the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of wine like nothing had happened. I watched her for a moment, trying to calm the anger bubbling inside me. How was work? I asked, trying to sound casual. She looked up surprised. Oh, it was fine. Long day. Jason kept us late again. She sipped her wine and smiled, as if nothing were out of the ordinary. Really? You didn't leave the office for drinks or anything? I asked, keeping my tone light. Her eyes flickered for a second, and then she shook her head. Nope. Just work. Why? I shrugged, forcing a smile. No reason. Just curious. Inside, I was seething. She was lying to my face, and I knew it. But instead of confronting her right then and there, I decided to wait. I needed more proof, something undeniable. I wasn't going to give her the chance to weasel out of this with another vague excuse. The next day, I called the boutique hotel and asked if they could confirm a reservation for Emily. They wouldn't give me details without her consent, but the woman on the phone hesitated long enough for me to know I was onto something. Sir, we can't share guest information, she said, sounding flustered. But if you're concerned about a charge, I can connect you to our billing department. Thanks, I replied, hanging up. I didn't need to hear more. Her reaction told me enough. Emily's lies were piling up, and I was getting closer to the truth. Whatever she was hiding, it was only a matter of time before everything came to light. But the question was I ready to face it? The weekend came, and Emily seemed completely unfazed, as if the past few days of sneaking around hadn't happened. She even suggested we go to brunch on Sunday, which felt out of character given how distant she'd been lately. Maybe she was trying to throw me off, or maybe guilt was eating at her. Either way, I agreed it would give me a chance to observe her in a neutral setting. Brunch was fine, but fine felt like an understatement for how hollow the whole experience was. She smiled, chatted about work, and even asked about my week, but it all felt forced. Her usual warmth, the thing that made me fall for her in the first place, was gone. I couldn't tell if I was projecting or if she was truly different, but either way, it hurt. After brunch, Emily suggested stopping by the mall to pick up a new dress for an upcoming office party. I followed along, trying to mask my growing unease. As we wandered from store to store, she tried on outfit after outfit, seeking my opinion but not really listening to it. The whole thing felt like a performance, and I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't for me. Then, something happened that flipped the script entirely. As we walked through the mall, I noticed her pause near one of the smaller cafes. Her face lit up in a way I hadn't seen in months. At first, I thought it was the prospect of coffee, but then I saw her glance toward a table near the back. A man was sitting there, sipping a drink, engrossed in his phone. It was Jason, Emily's boss. She didn't say anything, but the color in her cheeks gave her away. I pretended not to notice, but my pulse quickened. "Want to grab a coffee?" I asked, keeping my tone casual. "Oh no, I'm good," she said quickly, tugging my arm. "Let's keep going." I glanced over at Jason. He didn't seem to notice us, but the coincidence was too much to ignore. Why was he here? And why did Emily seem so desperate to avoid him? As we walked away, I decided to test the waters. "Wasn't your boss back there, Jason?" Emily's face stiffened, but she recovered quickly. "Huh? Oh yeah, I think so. Weird seeing him here. Let's not interrupt his weekend, though." Her nonchalance felt forced. If she wasn't trying to hide something, why the rush to get away? That night, I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my head. Emily had been so careful to maintain her facade, but seeing Jason had rattled her. It felt like a crack in the wall she'd built between us, and I was determined to break through. On Monday, I decided to take a risk. During my lunch break, I drove to Emily's office under the guise of surprising her. In truth, I wanted to see how she interacted with Jason in their element. I walked in with a bouquet of flowers and a box of her favorite chocolates, earning a few approving smiles from her coworkers. "Hey, I'm here to see Emily," I said to the receptionist, who directed me to the conference room. As I approached, I saw her through the glass door, sitting next to Jason. They were laughing about something, their heads close together. It didn't look inappropriate, but it didn't look strictly professional either. I hesitated for a moment before stepping in. "Surprise," I said, forcing a smile as I held up the flowers. Emily turned, startled. "Oh, Ben, what are you doing here?" "I thought I'd drop by and brighten your day," I said, setting the flowers on the table. Jason glanced between us, his expression unreadable. Thanks," Emily said, standing up and giving me a quick, awkward hug. "You didn't have to do that." Jason cleared his throat. "Nice to meet you, Ben," he said, extending a hand. "Emily speaks highly of you." "Good to meet you too," I replied, shaking his hand firmly. Too firmly, maybe. His smile didn't reach his eyes, and I could feel the tension in the room. The interaction was brief, but it told me enough. The way Emily fidgeted, the way Jason avoided eye contact, something was off. When I left, my suspicions had only deepened. I didn't know exactly what was going on, but I was getting closer to finding out. Whatever they were hiding, it was just a matter of time before it all unraveled. After the tense visit to Emily's office, I couldn't get the image of her and Jason laughing together out of my head. It wasn't outright damning, but it felt wrong. The way they sat so close, the way her laugh sounded too genuine for someone who's been so distant at home, it didn't add up. I decided it was time to stop second-guessing myself and start digging for real answers. That night, while Emily was asleep, I pulled out my laptop. I started by Googling Jason Miller, hoping to find anything that could shed light on what kind of man he was. His LinkedIn profile popped up first. It was typical stuff: Ivy League education, impressive career trajectory, and a long list of achievements. But then, buried in a local news article from a few years ago, I found a nugget of information that made my stomach drop. Jason had been accused of having an affair with a subordinate at his previous job. The article was vague, mentioning an internal investigation and Jason's eventual resignation. The woman involved wasn't named, but the implication was clear enough. Jason had a history of crossing lines at work. I sat back in my chair, staring at the screen. Could Emily be his next subordinate? Was I reading too much into this? My mind churned with possibilities. The next day, I decided to call an old friend of mine, Matt, who worked in corporate HR. I didn't want to jump to conclusions without more context, so I asked him if he'd ever heard anything about Jason Miller. Jason Miller? Matt said, sounding intrigued. Yeah, I remember that guy. He's sharp, but his name came up in some not-so-great conversations a while back. Why do you ask? Let's just say I'm curious about how he operates. I replied, trying to sound casual. What kind of not-so-great stuff are we talking about? Well, there was a rumor about an affair with someone on his team. Nothing ever went public, but it was messy. HR had to handle it quietly to avoid bad press. That guy's got a reputation for mixing business with personal interests. Matt's words hit me like a freight train. It wasn't definitive proof, but it painted Jason in a damning light. If he had a history of pursuing inappropriate relationships at work, then my suspicions about Emily weren't as far-fetched as I'd feared. That evening, I couldn't stop watching Emily. She seemed completely at ease, humming softly as she cooked dinner, scrolling through her phone every few minutes. She'd always been good at keeping her cool, but now I wondered if her composure was a mask. After dinner, I decided to ask her a pointed question. So, I was thinking about your boss, Jason, I said, keeping my tone light. She looked up, her brow furrowing slightly. What about him? I did some digging online, I admitted. Seems like he's had a colorful past at work. Emily froze for a moment before recovering with a small laugh. Oh, you mean those rumors about his old job? Yeah, I heard about that. People love to gossip. Her response felt too practiced, like she'd been expecting me to ask. I nodded, letting the conversation drop, but inside, my gut churned. She knew more than she was letting on, and I was determined to figure out what. Later that night, I took another step I hadn't planned on. I created a burner email account and sent a message to one of Emily's co-workers I'd met at the office Christmas party, a woman named Karen. Karen was friendly and talkative, someone I figured might be more forthcoming than Emily. I kept the email vague. Hi, Karen. I know this might be a bit awkward, but I've been hearing some things about Jason and wanted to get your perspective. Has anything seemed off with him lately? To my surprise, Karen responded within an hour. Hey, Ben. Honestly, Jason's always been a bit sketchy. He's super charming, but people in the office joke that he's a little too close with certain employees, if you catch my drift. I don't want to stir up trouble, but yeah, some folks have noticed he's been spending a lot of time with Emily. Could just be work-related, though. Hope that helps. The email was like a punch to the gut. It wasn't concrete evidence, but it confirmed my worst fears. People were noticing Jason's closeness with Emily. If even her co-workers were gossiping, then this wasn't just in my head. That night, I lay awake, my mind racing. Karen's email, Jason's past, Emily's lies, it all painted a grim picture. I didn't want to believe it, but the truth was staring me in the face. Emily wasn't just hiding something. She was hiding him. After Karen's email, the walls of denial I'd been clinging to started crumbling. I couldn't shake the thought that Emily and Jason were involved in something more than just late-night work sessions. But I still didn't have concrete proof, and I needed that before confronting her. The next morning, Emily left early, saying she had a client breakfast. I watched her drive off, my chest tight with suspicion. Instead of going to work, I decided to follow her. I know it sounds crazy, like something out of a bad TV drama, but at this point I was desperate for answers. She drove across town, stopping at a trendy cafe. I parked a block away and watched as she got out of the car, phone in hand, glancing around nervously. Moments later, Jason pulled into the lot in his sleek black sedan. My stomach twisted as he stepped out, casually dressed in a way that screamed, trying too hard. They didn't hug or do anything overtly inappropriate, but the way they walked inside together, leaning in close as they talked, was enough to make my blood boil. I waited a few minutes before heading into the cafe myself. I grabbed a coffee and found a seat near the back, pretending to scroll through my phone while keeping an eye on them. They sat at a corner table, their heads close together. Emily was smiling, really smiling, in a way I hadn't seen in months. Jason leaned forward, his hand brushing hers as he pointed to something on his phone. It wasn't definitive proof of anything, but it was intimate enough to make me feel like an outsider in my own marriage. When Emily got home later that evening, I couldn't bring myself to bring it up. Instead, I played the role of the clueless husband, asking about her client breakfast. "Oh, it went well," she said, not missing a beat. "We had a good discussion about some upcoming campaigns." I nodded, forcing a smile, but inside, I was seething. She lied to me so effortlessly, like it was second nature. I didn't press her further, knowing I needed a better plan if I was going to confront her. That night, I called Karen again, this time from the burner phone I'd used for my email. I didn't give her my name, but asked if she'd noticed anything unusual at work lately. "Well," she said hesitantly, "if you're asking about Jason, let's just say he has a habit of crossing boundaries. He's charming, but it's no secret he's gotten a little too friendly with some people in the office." When I asked if Emily was one of those people, Karen hesitated. "Look, I don't want to get anyone in trouble, but yeah, people have noticed he's been spending a lot of time with her. Lunches, late meetings, you name it. Could just be work stuff, but it feels off." Her words confirmed what I already knew. This wasn't just paranoia. Jason and Emily were hiding something, and I was done sitting on the sidelines. The next day, I decided to take a bold step. I called Jason's assistant, a young woman named Claire, and introduced myself as a freelance journalist working on a story about corporate culture. I asked if Jason would be available for an interview about his leadership style. "Oh, Jason's very busy," Claire said, her voice cheerful but firm. "But I can check his schedule." "What's your deadline?" "Soon," I replied. "I've heard great things about him, but I'd love to get more insight, especially about how he balances his personal and professional life." There was a pause. "Well, he's very committed to the team," Claire said cautiously. "He spends a lot of time mentoring employees. Emily Thompson, for example. He's really helped her grow in her role." I thanked her and hung up, my suspicions all but confirmed. Jason wasn't just helping Emily with her career. He was helping himself to my wife. That evening, I decided it was time to confront Emily. When she came home, I was waiting for her in the living room, her phone sitting on the coffee table in front of me. She froze in the doorway, her face pale. "Ben, what are you doing?" "Sit down," I said, my voice steady but cold. "We need to talk." Her eyes darted to her phone, and she hesitated before sitting down. "What's going on?" "I know about the breakfast, the meetings, the late nights," I said, keeping my gaze fixed on hers. "I know about Jason." Her face crumbled for a split second before she recovered, forcing a laugh. "Jason? Are you serious?" "He's my boss, Ben. There's nothing going on. Don't lie to me." I snapped, my voice rising. "I've seen you together. I've heard the whispers at your office. People are noticing, Emily. Do you know how humiliating that is for me?" Her lips parted, but no words came out. Finally, she said, "It's not what you think." "Then tell me what it is," I demanded. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're more interested in him than in your own husband." She stared at me, her eyes brimming with tears, but she didn't deny it. And that silence said more than any words ever could. Emily's silence hung in the air like a storm cloud. I stared at her, waiting for her to say something. Anything to explain herself. But she just sat there, her hands gripping the edge of the couch cushion, her lips pressed into a tight line. "Well," I finally said, my voice sharper than I intended. "Are you going to tell me the truth? Or should I spell it out for you?" Her eyes darted to the side, and I could see her brain working overtime, trying to come up with a response. Finally, she let out a shaky sigh. "Ben, you're being ridiculous. Jason is my boss. That's it. If people are talking, it's because we spend time together at work, but that's completely professional." "Professional?" I repeated, scoffing. "So, booking hotel rooms and sneaking out of bars is professional now?" That landed like a grenade. Her head snapped up, her eyes wide with shock. What? What are you talking about? I'm talking about the Westview Hotel, I said, my voice ice cold. You stayed there, didn't you? The same night you claimed you were at a team dinner. I've got the receipts, Emily. Literally. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. That wasn't what you think. She stopped, clearly struggling to come up with a believable excuse. Spare me, I said, cutting her off. I've given you every opportunity to come clean, and you keep lying to my face. I saw you with Jason at the cafe. I've heard what your coworkers are saying. I know, Emily. So stop pretending I'm an idiot. For a moment, she just sat there, her face pale and her eyes glossy with unshed tears. Finally, she broke. Okay, fine, she snapped, her voice shaking with a mix of anger and desperation. Yes, I went to the hotel that night. But it wasn't what you think. I needed some space. Things have been tense between us, and I needed to clear my head. I stared at her, disbelief washing over me. Space? You expect me to believe you booked a hotel room just to think? That you didn't invite Jason to join you? Her face twisted in frustration. No, he wasn't there. I swear. Why are you so quick to assume the worst? Because you've given me every reason to. I shot back. The lies, the secrecy, the way you light up when you're around him but act like a ghost when you're with me. Do you even hear yourself? This isn't about me assuming the worst. It's about you making it impossible for me to trust you. Emily looked away, her jaw tight. I'm not sleeping with him, Ben. Believe what you want, but that's the truth. Her words should have reassured me, but they didn't. Not with everything I'd seen and heard. Not with the way she avoided my eyes, the way her hands trembled as she spoke. If you're not, then prove it, I said, my voice low but firm. Show me your phone. Let me see the messages between you and Jason. Her head whipped back toward me, and her expression shifted from defensive to outright defiant. No, that's private. Private? I repeated, laughing bitterly. You want me to believe there's nothing going on, but you won't let me see your messages? You're practically waving a red flag, Emily. She crossed her arms over her chest, her posture rigid. I'm not doing this with you, Ben. You're acting paranoid, and I'm not going to let you invade my privacy just because you're insecure. Insecure? I snapped, anger flaring in my chest. This isn't insecurity. It's common sense. You've been lying to me for months, sneaking around, and now you want to play the victim? Unbelievable. We sat there, glaring at each other, the tension between us so thick it felt suffocating. Finally, Emily stood up, grabbing her purse from the chair. I can't do this right now, she said, her voice cold. I'm going for a drive. Of course you are, I muttered as she stormed out the door. I heard her car start up and speed away, leaving me alone in the silence of our living room. I sat there for hours, replaying the argument in my head. Emily's defensiveness, her refusal to let me see her phone, it all pointed to one thing. She wasn't just lying to protect her privacy. She was lying to protect him. By the time she came home, it was past midnight. I didn't bother getting up to greet her. Instead, I stayed on the couch, staring blankly at the TV as she walked past without saying a word. As the house fell silent again, one thing became painfully clear. Emily and I were standing on opposite sides of a canyon, and the bridge between us was crumbling fast. The next morning, Emily acted like nothing had happened. She moved around the house with her usual efficiency, pouring coffee, packing a small lunch, and scrolling through her phone like we hadn't just had a massive fight the night before. I watched her from across the room, wondering how she could be so composed after everything. So, I said, breaking the silence, do you feel better after your drive last night? She glanced up, her expression neutral. Yeah, I needed some air. I'm sorry about everything, Ben. I know this has been hard on you. It wasn't the apology I was looking for. That's it? Sorry. You can't just say that and expect everything to go back to normal. She sighed, setting her coffee mug down. I don't know what else you want me to say. I told you, there's nothing going on with Jason. You're making this into something it's not. Her calmness only fueled my frustration. Then why can't you just prove it? Show me your phone, Emily. If you have nothing to hide, why are you so afraid of being honest? She shook her head, Her lips pressed into a thin line. I'm not going to do that. This isn't about hiding anything. It's about trust. If you trusted me, we wouldn't be having this conversation. Her words cut deep, but they didn't change the facts. You don't get to talk about trust when you've been lying to me for months. I shot back. Trust is earned, and right now, you're doing everything possible to destroy it. The tension between us was palpable, but before I could say anything else, her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at it quickly, then flipped it over, the screen facing down. That little gesture sent my mind spiraling. Who was that? I asked, my tone sharp. Work, she said too quickly. Just a reminder about a meeting. Really? Then why did you look like you'd seen a ghost? Emily's eyes flashed with irritation. I didn't. You're reading into everything, Ben. This is exactly why I didn't want to have this conversation. That evening, after Emily had gone to bed, I decided I couldn't take the guessing game anymore. I opened my laptop and pulled up the tracking app I'd installed on her phone. I hadn't checked it since following her to the boutique hotel, but now felt like the right time to see if anything else seemed suspicious. At first, her recent locations were all ordinary. Home, work, the grocery store. But then I noticed something odd. There was a location ping from the previous evening, around the time she'd gone on her drive. It wasn't a park or a scenic overlook like I might have expected. Instead, it was a residential address in a different part of town. Curious, I copied the address and pasted it into Google Maps. It was a modest house in a quiet neighborhood, nothing remarkable. But as I zoomed in, something caught my eye. Jason Miller's name listed on the public directory for that address. My stomach dropped. Emily hadn't gone for a drive to clear her head. She'd gone to Jason's house. The next morning, I was waiting for her in the kitchen when she came downstairs. She looked tired, like she hadn't slept much. Good, I thought bitterly. Neither had I. Morning, she said cautiously, clearly trying to gauge my mood. Morning, I replied, keeping my tone neutral. I wanted to ask you something. Okay, she said slowly, pouring herself a cup of coffee. Where did you really go last night? I asked, watching her closely. Her hand froze mid-pour, but she quickly recovered. I told you, I went for a drive. Right, I said, leaning back against the counter. And that drive just happened to take you to Jason's house? Her face went pale, and she set the coffee pot down with a clatter. What are you talking about? I know, Emily, I said, my voice steady but cold. I know you were at his house. Stop lying to me. For a moment, she just stared at me, her mouth slightly open like she wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. Finally, she shook her head. You've been tracking me? Are you serious, Ben? Don't try to turn this around on me, I snapped. This isn't about the tracker. It's about you sneaking off to see your boss in the middle of the night, and then lying to my face about it. It wasn't like that, she said quickly, her voice rising. I wasn't doing anything wrong. Jason and I. Don't. I interrupted, my anger bubbling to the surface. Don't you dare try to justify this. Just tell me the truth, Emily. Are you sleeping with him? Her face crumpled, and for the first time, she looked genuinely panicked. No, I'm not. I swear, Ben, it's not what you think. Then what is it? I demanded, because from where I'm standing, it looks pretty clear. Tears welled up in her eyes, and she buried her face in her hands. I can't do this right now, she said, her voice muffled. I need time. Time, I repeated, incredulous. Time for what? To come up with another excuse? Another lie? She didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed her coffee and fled the room, leaving me standing there, more certain than ever that our marriage was hanging by a thread, and she was holding the scissors. The day after our argument, Emily avoided me completely. She left early for work without so much as a goodbye, and came home late, claiming she'd been stuck in meetings. Her avoidance was almost comical, but it only made my resolve stronger. Whatever she was hiding, it was tearing us apart, and I wasn't going to let her bury it under silence and half-hearted excuses. I spent most of the evening pacing the living room, trying to decide my next move. I couldn't confront her again without solid evidence. She'd just deflect or twist the situation like she always did. But what more could I find? I already had the address, the hotel email, the lies. What else did I need to prove to myself that she wasn't being honest? Around 10 p.m., Emily finally walked through the door. She looked tired and worn down, but I wasn't in the mood to sympathize. Late night at work? I asked, unable to keep the edge out of my voice. She hesitated, then nodded. Yeah, Jason wanted to review some of the campaign data before tomorrow's presentation. There it was again. Jason. Always Jason. I clenched my fists, biting back the urge to snap. Instead, I just nodded, letting her think I'd bought the lie. But in my head, I was already planning my next move. The following day, while Emily was at work, I decided to take things a step further. I drove to Jason's neighborhood and parked a block away from his house. It felt ridiculous, like I was some kind of amateur detective in a bad soap opera, but I needed to see for myself if there was something I was missing. I sat there for hours, watching as cars came and went. Most of the traffic was unremarkable. A mail truck, a delivery van, a few neighbors walking their dogs. But then, around lunchtime, I saw it. Emily's car pulling into Jason's driveway. My heart pounded as I watched her get out, carrying a folder and what looked like a lunch bag. She knocked on the door, and seconds later, Jason opened it, greeting her with a smile that made my blood boil. She stepped inside, and the door closed behind her. I sat there, staring at the house, my mind racing. She'd lied again. She wasn't stuck in meetings. She was here with him. When Emily got home that evening, I was waiting for her. She walked in, her expression neutral, but when she saw the look on my face, she froze. "What's wrong?" she asked, feigning innocence. "You tell me," I said, crossing my arms. "How was your day?" "It was fine," she said cautiously. "Busy, as usual." "Why?" "Really?" "Because I could have sworn I saw you at Jason's house around noon," I said, my voice cold. "Want to explain that?" Her face went pale, and for a moment, she just stared at me. "You were following me?" she said, her voice rising. "Don't turn this around on me," I snapped. "This isn't about me following you. It's about you lying to my face over and over again." "Why were you at his house, Emily?" She opened her mouth, then closed it again, clearly struggling to come up with an answer. Finally, she said, "I was dropping off some files for work. Jason needed them for the presentation tomorrow." "Don't insult my intelligence," I said, my voice shaking with anger. "You don't need to go to his house to drop off files. That's what email is for. So, what's the real reason?" She threw her hands up in frustration. "I don't know what you want from me, Ben. I've told you 100 times. There's nothing going on. You're just looking for reasons to be suspicious. And you're giving me plenty of reasons to be." I shot back. "Do you even realize how ridiculous this all looks? The hotel, the late nights, the secret meetings. Do you expect me to believe this is all just a coincidence?" Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment I thought she might finally come clean. But instead, she shook her head. "I'm not doing this," she said quietly. "I can't keep defending myself against things that aren't true." She turned and walked out of the room, leaving me standing there, more furious and heartbroken than ever. Later that night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I realized I had reached my breaking point. I couldn't keep living like this, questioning every move she made, wondering if she was lying to me again. If she wasn't going to be honest, I'd have to find the truth myself. I picked up my phone and dialed a private investigator I'd found online earlier that day. When they answered, I didn't hesitate. "I need help finding out if my wife is cheating on me," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil in my chest. It wasn't a decision I'd made lightly, but it felt like the only option left. If Emily wanted to keep hiding the truth, I'd make sure there was nowhere left for her to hide. The private investigator, Mark, was a no-nonsense kind of guy, calm, professional, and straight to the point. During our initial conversation, I explained the situation as succinctly as possible. Emily's lies, Jason's involvement, the suspicious behavior. It all spilled out in a torrent of frustration and desperation. Mark listened without interruption, taking notes as I spoke. "Sounds like you've already got plenty of circumstantial evidence," he said once I finished. "What you need now is hard proof." "That's exactly what I want," I replied. "Something undeniable." Mark assured me he'd start immediately. He'd follow Emily, observe her interactions with Jason, and document everything. It felt surreal hiring someone to spy on my wife, but I told myself it was necessary. If Emily was innocent, This would clear her name. If she wasn't, well, then I'd finally have the closure I needed. For the next few days, I barely spoke to Emily. We went through the motions of our routines like two strangers living under the same roof. She seemed tense, like she could sense the growing chasm between us, but she didn't say anything. And I didn't ask. Mark sent me updates daily. At first, there was nothing out of the ordinary. Emily went to work, ran errands, and came straight home. I started to question if I'd overreacted, if maybe her secrecy was more about stress than infidelity. But on the third day, everything changed. "Got something for you," Mark said during our nightly check-in. His tone was clipped, professional, but I could hear the weight of what he was about to say. "What is it?" I asked, bracing myself. "Your wife met with Jason at a hotel this afternoon. The Lakeside Inn. I have photos of them going in and leaving together." My stomach dropped. "Did you see what they were doing inside?" "No, but they were in there for over 2 hours. I also have video footage of them embracing in the parking lot before they left. It's pretty clear what's going on." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I'd suspected it, feared it, but hearing it confirmed was something else entirely. I sat there in silence, my chest tight, my mind spinning. "Do you want me to keep digging?" Mark asked after a moment. "No," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I have what I need." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept staring at the photos Mark had emailed me. Emily and Jason walking into the hotel, her face lit with a smile I hadn't seen in months, his hand on the small of her back. And then the video, where they hugged tightly in the parking lot before parting ways. It was undeniable now. Emily was cheating on me. I felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, sadness, betrayal, and even relief. As painful as it was, I finally had the truth. There were no more what-ifs, no more second-guessing myself. Emily had made her choice, and now it was time for me to make mine. The next morning, I woke up early and started packing a bag. Emily came downstairs as I zipped it up, her brow furrowing in confusion. "What are you doing?" she asked, her voice groggy. "Leaving," I said simply, not looking at her. "Leaving?" she repeated, her voice rising. "Ben, what are you talking about?" I turned to face her, my expression hard. "I know, Emily. I know about you and Jason. I have photos. I have video. Don't even try to deny it." Her face went pale, and for a moment, she looked like she might faint. "Ben, I can explain." "Explain what?" I snapped, cutting her off. "That you've been lying to me for months? That you've been sneaking around with your boss while I sat at home, trying to figure out why my wife was pulling away?" "There's nothing to explain, Emily. I know everything." Tears welled up in her eyes, and she stepped toward me, her hands outstretched. "Please, just let me—" "No," I said firmly, stepping back. "I don't want to hear it. You made your choice, Emily. And now, I'm making mine." Her tears fell freely now, but I didn't care. The pain and anger in my chest outweighed any sympathy I might have felt. "You can have Jason," I said coldly. "Good luck making it work. But I'm done." I grabbed my bag and walked out the door, leaving her standing there, sobbing. As I drove away, a strange sense of calm washed over me. The betrayal still hurt, but for the first time in months, I felt free. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let Emily's lies define me. This was the end of our story, and the beginning of mine. Driving away from the home I'd shared with Emily was both liberating and heartbreaking. I didn't have a plan beyond getting as far away from the pain as possible. My phone buzzed repeatedly with messages from Emily, but I didn't bother reading them. I wasn't ready to face her excuses, her pleas for understanding, or whatever lies she'd come up with to salvage her image. Instead, I checked into a cheap motel on the edge of town. The room was nothing fancy, a bed, a desk, and a TV bolted to the wall, but it gave me the space I desperately needed. I sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the stained carpet as the reality of my situation began to sink in. My marriage was over. Everything I'd built with Emily, the life we'd shared, the dreams we'd had, it was all gone. The first few days were a blur. I called in sick to work, ignoring emails and voicemails. The only person I talked to was my sister, Lisa. She'd always been my rock, and when I told her what happened, she didn't hesitate. "Come stay with me," she said firmly. You don't need to be alone right now. I wanted to argue, to tell her I was fine, but I wasn't. So, I packed up and drove 2 hours to her place. Lisa greeted me with a tight hug and a fridge full of comfort food, like she knew I needed more than just a shoulder to lean on. Over the next week, I started piecing my life back together, one small step at a time. I found a therapist, someone Lisa recommended, who helped me untangle the mess of emotions swirling in my head. Anger, sadness, confusion, and even guilt. They all came out during our sessions. The therapist helped me see that while I wasn't perfect, Emily's choices were hers alone. I also started reaching out to friends, something I hadn't done in years. Emily had always been the social one in our marriage, and I'd let myself fall into the background. But now, reconnecting with old friends felt like a lifeline. They listened without judgment, offering support and a few beers when words weren't enough. Meanwhile, Emily kept trying to reach out. Her messages ranged from tearful apologies to angry accusations, as if she couldn't decide whether to beg for forgiveness or blame me for leaving. I read a few of them, but never responded. What was there to say? She betrayed me in the worst way possible, and no amount of words could undo that. One day, she called while I was at Lisa's. I almost ignored it, but something in me wanted closure. I stepped outside and answered, bracing myself for whatever she had to say. "Ben," she said, her voice trembling. "Please, can we just talk? I need to explain." "There's nothing to explain," I replied flatly. "I saw the photos, Emily. I know what you did." "It wasn't an affair," she insisted, her voice breaking. "Jason and I, yes, we got close, but it was never physical. I swear. It was emotional, but I stopped it before it went too far." Her words were like salt in a wound. "So what? You expect me to believe this was some innocent friendship? That sneaking around, lying, and meeting at hotels was just emotional bonding?" "No," she said quietly. "I know I messed up. I know I broke your trust. But I still love you, Ben. Please, can we try to fix this?" I let out a bitter laugh. "Fix this? Emily, you didn't just break my trust. You shattered it. You can't expect me to come back after everything you've done." "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I don't know what else to say." "You've said enough," I replied, my voice firm. "I'm done, Emily. I deserve better than this." I hung up before she could respond, my hands shaking. It wasn't easy, but it felt right. For the first time, I was putting myself first. The weeks that followed were a roller coaster. Some days, I felt like I was moving forward, focusing on work and spending time with Lisa's family. Other days, the weight of the betrayal hit me all over again, and I'd find myself staring at old photos, wondering how things had gone so wrong. But slowly, things started to change. I found joy in small moments, cooking dinner with Lisa's kids, going for long runs to clear my head, rediscovering hobbies I'd abandoned during my marriage. It wasn't a perfect life, but it was mine, and that was enough. One evening, as I sat on Lisa's porch watching the sunset, she joined me with 2 mugs of tea. "You seem lighter," she said, handing me a cup. "Yeah," I said, surprising myself with the realization. "I think I am." She smiled. "Good. You deserve it." As I sipped my tea, I thought about everything I'd been through. The lies, the heartbreak, the painful truths. It wasn't the life I'd planned, but it was a life I could rebuild. And for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could breathe again. With each passing day, I felt more like myself again. The anger I'd carried around for weeks started to fade, replaced by a cautious hope for the future. My time at Lisa's house had given me the space I needed to heal, and her constant support reminded me that I wasn't alone in this. But Emily wasn't done trying to claw her way back into my life. One afternoon, I got an email from her, longer and more heartfelt than any of the texts or calls she'd made since I left. It wasn't just an apology. It was a full-blown confession. She admitted to the emotional affair, detailing how it started with late-night work calls and escalated to clandestine lunches and the infamous hotel meetings. She swore up and down that it never got physical, but at that point, it didn't matter. The betrayal ran deeper than just physical intimacy. It was the lies, the secrecy, and the choice to turn to someone else when things got tough. "I don't know if you'll ever forgive me," she wrote, but I hope someday you'll understand how sorry I am. I was selfish, and I let you down. I don't expect you to come back, but I needed to say this." Reading her words was like ripping off a scab. Part of me wanted to lash out, to remind her of all the pain she'd caused, but another part of me felt indifferent. I didn't need her apology to move on. I didn't need her to spell out her guilt to validate my pain. I'd already decided we were done, and nothing she said could change that. I didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. A week later, I had a meeting with my lawyer to start the divorce process. Sitting in that sterile office, discussing how to divide assets and navigate the legal maze of ending a marriage, felt surreal. But it also felt like closure. This was the final step in reclaiming my life. Emily didn't fight me on anything. She signed the papers without protest, and within a few weeks, it was official. We were no longer husband and wife, just two people who had shared a life and then lost it. As for Jason, I heard through the grapevine that things didn't work out so well for him. Word of his relationship with Emily had spread at their office, and HR launched an investigation. Apparently, Jason had a history of blurring boundaries with female employees, and this was the final straw. He resigned before they could fire him, and last I heard, he was struggling to find work in the same field. Good riddance. Meanwhile, I started making plans for the future. I found an apartment closer to my job, a small but cozy place that felt like a fresh start. I threw myself into work, taking on new projects and finding a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I also started hitting the gym regularly, not just to blow off steam, but to rebuild my confidence. The most surprising change, though, was how I reconnected with myself. I picked up old hobbies like woodworking and photography that I'd let slip during my marriage. I joined a hiking group on the weekends and met people who reminded me that life didn't have to revolve around the past. Slowly but surely, I was building a new life, one that felt honest and whole. One evening, a few months after the divorce was finalized, I got a call from an old college friend, Matt. He'd heard about the split and invited me out for a beer. At first, I was hesitant. I wasn't sure if I was ready to socialize like that, but eventually, I agreed. Sitting in that crowded bar, catching up with Matt and swapping stories, I realized how far I'd come. I laughed, really laughed, for the first time in months. It wasn't just the beer or the nostalgia. It was the feeling that I was finally free from the weight of Emily's betrayal. When I got home that night, I sat on my couch, staring out at the city lights. For the first time in a long time, I didn't feel anger or sadness. I felt peace. Emily had broken my trust, shattered our marriage, and left me questioning everything I thought I knew. But in the process, I discovered something important: myself. I didn't know what the future held, but I knew one thing. I was ready for it. Months after the divorce, life had finally settled into a rhythm. It wasn't always easy. I still had moments where the weight of everything that happened crept in, but those moments were fewer and farther between. My time was filled with work, hobbies, and reconnecting with friends. Slowly but surely, I was rediscovering who I was outside of being Emily's husband. One Saturday morning, I joined a local hiking group for a trail run. It was one of those crisp fall days where the air was cool enough to keep you moving, but the sun still peeked through the trees. I joined the group for exercise and camaraderie, not expecting anything more. But as I jogged along the trail, I found myself running beside someone who'd changed my perspective entirely. Her name was Sarah, and she had an easy smile that matched her steady pace. We struck up a conversation somewhere between mile 2 and mile 3, talking about everything from our favorite hiking spots to the best coffee shops in town. There was something refreshing about her. No pretense, no awkwardness, just an openness that felt rare. "Do you come here often?" I asked, wincing at how cliché it sounded. She laughed, brushing a stray curl out of her face. "Not as much as I'd like. Work keeps me busy, but I try to squeeze in a run when I can." "What do you do?" I asked, genuinely curious. "I'm a graphic designer," she said. "Freelance, mostly. It gives me some flexibility, but deadlines can get intense." "What about you?" "I work in tech," I said. "Mostly project management. It's not as exciting as designing things, but it pays the bills." She smiled, and for a moment, the conversation paused as we both focused on navigating a steep incline. When we reached the top, she turned to me, her eyes bright. You're not bad at this, she said teasingly. Most people are gasping for air by now. I chuckled, feeling an unexpected warmth in her compliment. I try to keep up. After the run, the group gathered at a nearby cafe for coffee and snacks. Sarah and I ended up sitting together, continuing our conversation like old friends. I learned she was a transplant to the city, originally from a small town upstate, and had joined the hiking group to meet new people. She had a way of making even mundane details sound interesting, and before I knew it, hours had passed. As we parted ways, she smiled and said, "It was nice meeting you, Ben. Hopefully, I'll see you at the next hike." "Definitely," I said, meaning it. Over the next few weeks, Sarah and I kept running into each other, on hikes, at group meetups, even at the occasional coffee shop. Each time, our conversations grew more personal, more natural. She had a way of making me feel at ease, like I didn't have to hide the parts of myself I wasn't proud of. One evening, after a particularly grueling hike, we found ourselves lingering in the parking lot, neither of us wanting to leave. The sun was setting, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt truly content. "Can I ask you something?" Sarah said, her tone cautious. "Of course," I replied. "Why did you join the hiking group?" she asked, tilting her head slightly. "You don't seem like someone who's struggling to meet people." I hesitated, unsure how much to share, but something about Sarah's sincerity made me feel safe. I needed a fresh start, I admitted. I went through a pretty rough divorce, and this felt like a good way to clear my head. Her expression softened. "I'm sorry. That must have been really hard." "It was," I said honestly, "but it also taught me a lot about myself. I've learned to appreciate the little things like this." I gestured to the view around us, the fading light casting long shadows across the trees. Sarah smiled, her eyes meeting mine. "Sometimes, the little things are the most important." That night, as I drove home, I found myself smiling for no reason. I wasn't sure what the future held with Sarah, if it was a friendship, something more, or just a fleeting connection. But for the first time in a long time, I felt hopeful. It was a small glimmer of light in the darkness I'd been living in, and I wasn't going to let it slip away. This wasn't the life I planned, but maybe, just maybe, it could still be something beautiful. In the weeks that followed, Sarah and I began spending more time together. At first, it was casual, grabbing coffee after a hike or meeting up for a quick lunch between work. But as our conversations deepened, so did the connection between us. She had a way of making me laugh, even when I didn't think I had it in me. And her honesty was a breath of fresh air after months of secrecy and lies. One chilly evening, as we walked along the riverfront, she asked me a question that stopped me in my tracks. "Do you ever think about what's next for you? Like, beyond all of this?" She gestured vaguely, as if encompassing the complexities of life, healing, and starting over. I thought for a moment, the sound of the river rushing past filling the silence. "Honestly, I'm not sure. For a long time, I couldn't see past what happened with Emily. It felt like my entire future had been ripped away. But now, I don't know. It's like I'm finally realizing there's more out there." She smiled, her breath visible in the cold night air. "There is. You just have to let yourself see it." That conversation stuck with me. Over the next few months, I began to open myself up to the idea of what's next. I started taking small steps, volunteering at a local animal shelter, signing up for a photography class, and even booking a solo trip to a national park I'd always wanted to visit. Each new experience felt like a piece of myself coming back together. Through it all, Sarah was there. She never pushed or pried, but her presence was a steady source of comfort. We weren't rushing into anything. We both had our own wounds to heal, but there was an unspoken understanding between us. Whatever this was, it was built on something real. One Saturday morning, as we sat in a cafe, Sarah turned to me with a mischievous grin. "So, have you thought about dating again? Like officially?" Her question caught me off guard, but I couldn't help but smile. "I don't know," I admitted. The idea of putting myself out there again is intimidating. "Understandable," she said, sipping her coffee. "But just so you know, I think you do great." "Yeah?" I asked, raising an eyebrow. "Yeah," she said, her grin softening into something more genuine. "You're a good guy, Ben. You've been through a lot, but you're still standing. That says something. Her words hit me harder than I expected. For so long, I'd seen myself as broken, defined by what had happened with Emily. But maybe Sarah was right. Maybe I wasn't just surviving, I was rebuilding. And maybe it was time to let myself hope for more. A few weeks later, as Sarah and I walked through a snowy park, I finally worked up the courage to take a leap. We'd been skirting around the edges of something more for a while, but I knew it was time to be honest. "Sarah," I said, stopping in the middle of the path. She turned to me, her cheeks flushed from the cold. "I've been thinking about what you said, about what's next, and I think I'd like that to include you." Her eyes widened, and for a moment, I worried I'd misread everything. But then she smiled, a smile so warm it could have melted the snow around us. "I'd like that too," she said softly. That moment marked the start of something new. Sarah and I didn't rush. We took things one step at a time, allowing our connection to grow naturally. But for the first time in years, I felt like I was building a life I could be proud of. Looking back, I realized that what Emily had done didn't define me. Her betrayal had shattered the life we built, but it also forced me to rebuild something stronger. I'd found myself again, piece by piece, and in the process, I discovered a capacity for resilience I didn't know I had. Life doesn't always go as planned, but sometimes the detours lead to places you never expected. For me, that place was a new beginning, one filled with hope, possibility, and maybe, just maybe, a second chance at happiness.